I get a lot of people telling me, Star, you're a big incel and you're bad for reasons and we hate you because stuff. I get a lot of comments telling me that I have just like really immature perspectives on like the way that I want to live my life and the way that I want to do things. And the only way I really know how to respond to that is to ask yourself, well, what are your personal preferences? How do you feel about the life that you live? What do you want to do? And if there's something that you want to do and it makes you happy, then why should I come into your place, your house, your the place that you typically reside on the internet or like in real life and go, hey you, yeah, you over there, that job that you like doing and those goals that you aspire to, or rather those things that make you uncomfortable or you simply feel are useless in your daily life that you don't want to do, you should do them because I said so, because my standard just says that you should do those things. I don't really think that's rational. It's not really like a rational way of thinking about things. Everyone has different needs. Everyone has different things that they want to do. And yeah, like I can see the argument of certain things, for example, if you're harming other people, if that's against the law and it's making society as a whole worse for everybody to have killed those people, which in a lot of cases does that, then that would obviously be a case of doing something bad because those aren't things that are a net benefit. And so, like, I can see people arguing stuff like that, but that's not the type of thing I'm arguing about. Like, I'm talking about people who say, Star, you should want to learn how to drive, or Star, you should want to get, like, a traditional job that isn't a job that you want to do. Like, stuff like that is weird to me, because it's just playing into this very strange, jingoistic, almost dogmatism that a lot of people have, where they tell you you have to live a certain way because a lot of people have lived that way, and so therefore it's good and it's true. But I feel like what they kind of fail to acknowledge is that there's other ways to live, there's other ways to do things. If in practical terms, if you're able to get to point A to point B and continue to be happy, and continue to make use of the resources you have in the most effective way possible for you, and you're living out a peaceful life that doesn't disturb the peace of others, what's the point of telling someone that they're a faggot and that they have to live the way that you do? You're only projecting your own lifestyle onto them to basically no end. Like, it doesn't really help anything. It just kind of shows that you're getting mad. Like there's no reason for it, in my opinion. And maybe I'm wrong, but like from everything that I've seen, from all of these people who try to argue these things, I will make a point, for example, I don't want to drive. Well, I don't want to get a driver's license. And people say, oh, you're a fag for wanting to do that. It's insane. You need to grow up like everybody else. And then I go, well, okay, wait a minute. What part of growing up has to do with getting a license? I thought growing up was about having a source of income where you're not relying on other people, where it's about emotional maturity and knowing how to conduct yourself in a way that's respectful and not harmful to others, where it's about being able to have the wisdom to be able to properly conduct yourself, to be able, like these things, financial stability, security, these things, which I mean, even to an extent, I would argue against the validity of those claims as being quote unquote adult or whatever, but I'm going to concede to them for the sake of this argument. So let's say, for instance, you don't want to drive. You hate the idea of driving. You just don't want to do it. But you have a job that's paying you $50,000 a year consistently, very stable job. You're able to, I don't know, raise a family on that money. You're able to live in a fairly nice place where you have access to lots of public transit and fairly good healthcare, fairly good education, these types of things. Fairly basic things that people tend to aspire to when they talk about settling down and being a quote unquote adult. If you have all of those things, what's the point of knowing how to drive? Because at that point, you already have all of the things, right? Like, why do you need to tack on knowing how to drive onto all of these other things that already ostensibly do the function that you needed to do to be adult, you know? Like, and then when I try to sort of apply that to my own life, and I think about, well, what function does this serve? Why would I need to know this? Why would I need to have this? And I can't help but continue coming up blank, because unless I just want to live the super uber country life and go away from everybody, which I doubt I would end up doing unless like I vastly changed as a person. I like big bustling cities and stuff like that. Um, unless all of a sudden I had a change of heart and I wanted to live on a farm, yeah, of course I would have to know how to drive. But like, if I'm just living in the middle of the city like everybody else, and there's public transit that's widely available, why not just take the public transit or have a partner, if I ever actually get one of those, that can drive themselves? Like, what is this stigma about men not driving? Like, we live in a what I think is supposed to be a fairly tolerant world. Women are allowed to work, they're allowed to drive. What's this social stigma of letting a woman drive for you? That they're an adult, they're an able-bodied adult with their own life and emotions and desires and freedom. They should be allowed to do that. If you don't want to, like, I don't understand the logic, the reasoning that would apply this like social status mindset to everybody of like, you're less of a man if you do this, or you're less of an adult if you do this, when in practice, when you talk in clearly practical terms, those things do not matter. It's about getting to point A to point B in a practical fashion. And so when you start thinking about that, all of these like weird social hierarchy nuances of shaming others for not being a certain way all start to kind of fade away. They all start to kind of dissolve. And, when I say why I don't want to, why I don't want to get a job, or why I don't want to get a job, I want to get a job, but why I don't want to drive, well, I don't want to get a traditional job. I want to work as a translator, which is a little bit more of like an entrepreneurial type thing. But like, when I talk about why I don't want to drive, I'm talking pretty clearly from a practical standpoint. Like, the act of paying for a car would be a lot of money for something that I can just go on the train to do, something I can just go on the bus to do. It's a little bit of added effort, but the money that you would save from not having to do car payments would be vastly more advantageous for you. Where, like, especially if you live in a bigger city where, it costs money to store a vehicle. And so if you're having to spend all this money on the vehicle itself and on storing the vehicle, then at what point does it become worth it? If you're not traveling all over the country all the time by car when you could do so by train, like, when you start to notice these things, these sort of impracticalities to it, it becomes really weird. It's really weird to me. You can just take the train. You can just take the bus. You can just take an Uber, which, I mean, I wouldn't recommend because it costs a lot of money. You can move to a place that has the proper public transit infrastructure to get to point A to point B, fairly well. There's a reason why you go to a country like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, China, all these places. I mean, China especially, a lot of those people don't have cars. And a lot of that has to do with environmental reasons, is that the government has pretty strict regulations on who can buy a car. They actually have an auction for the different license plates that they register to different vehicles. So it's strictly controlled. And a lot of those vehicles that are produced over there tend to be electric in order to, keep smog and stuff out. But regardless, a lot of people in China don't drive vehicles. They don't have to. All they have to do is to get on one of the high-speed trains, which they have the best and most efficient high-speed rail in the entire world. That's very cheap, despite the fact that Chinese rail costs an absurd amount of money to produce all over the country. They just make it super cheap because they're state-subsidized companies. And so you can get really cheap train tickets to go basically anywhere you want to, take your commute to work and whatnot. And you're pretty much fine from there. Like, there's lots of countries around the world that are like that. It's not just China. You know, Japan is always the famous example, is that, you know, you get movies like Densha Otoko or Train Man where, you know, you have a character that, like, rescues this girl from being groped on a train. I mean, I guess that would be one motivation to drive a car, but it's not that, you know, it's not that common of an occurrence. It's not that big of a thing that happens all over the world. It's just in specific instances with women, which, I mean, as long as you're not a woman, as long as you're an able-bodied man, if you have a woman, I would like to believe that you can fend for her and fight. But if you can't do that, I would recommend getting into a position where you can, I guess. But, like, you know, it's really weird to me when I hear these sorts of arguments being made, because I don't think it comes from, like, a practical place. Like, for me, when I think about practicality, I go, okay, what is the easiest to do? What's the most efficient? And what's the cheapest? And the answer inevitably ends up ringing back to public transit. If you go to a country with a very a well-done public transit system that's well integrated into the country, then you're going to be able to just use that public transit. There's no reason to have a car at that point and to spend thousands and thousands of dollars on car payments. You know, like, that's the thing that I don't understand, is this kind of obsession with doing things in a traditional way, when a lot of the time the traditional way that your parents did it, that everyone else did it, that people supposedly call the American dream, as soon as you start questioning the fundamentals of that dream, you begin to realize that for certain people like myself, it's far more efficient to just do public transit, to just not have a license. And I mean, the other thing is the fatalities that are caused in cars are pretty heavy. And I mean, I'm not one of these guys who's talking all the time about risks doing things, you know, like, you know, I'm not gonna sit here and knock on wood all day about the various risks and dangers of doing just about anything. But I do think it is a significant defense for my point, is that, like, you're much more likely to be fine in public transit with well-trained officials doing the job, in a fairly secure and studied area, than, you know, just relying on the anarchy of the road to guide you in a car that you've spent all this money on, that if you crash, yeah, you might be okay, but now you have to deal with all these insurance problems, and that's a whole other bag. Like, if you're barely using the vehicle, and if the times that you're using the vehicle have big risks involved that public transit doesn't have, and if you have to spend a bunch of money, not just on car payments, but also on insurance, deductibles, copay, like, all of this stuff, it all blends in with one another. It's a tapestry. It's not just something that exists in a vacuum. You have to look at it in practical terms. And so, like, when I think about this stuff, I think, well, the most practical thing for me to do would be to just boycott the system entirely and just not have a car, because it would cost less and I would be able to get around just fine and go to the places that I would need to go to. Like, I don't see why that's a problem. I don't see how that somehow makes me more of an incel or, like, more of a man-child or whatever just because I want to do that. It's just a different way of living. You look at countries all over the world, lots of people don't have cars because they can't afford them, and it's less practical for them to buy a car. There's nothing wrong with it. There's no shame in just having less wealth than somebody else, or than choosing to spend your wealth in a different way, as long as you're still getting to point A to point B in a practical fashion, in an efficient fashion that doesn't harm anyone else. I think I've made my point.